Ilara felt the cold not as a temperature, but as a judgment. It was a verdict delivered by the wind that swept down from the Ironback Mountains, a final, unappealable sentence handed down by a world that had taken everything else. Her husband, Thomas, had been claimed by the earth in the spring, a sudden fever that burned through him like a forest fire, leaving only ash and memory. Now, in the autumn of that same year, the world seemed determined to claim the rest. The cold seeped through the thin wool of her shawl, a precursor to the winter that the valley elders were already predicting would be the harshest in a generation. They spoke of the way the squirrels were hoarding nuts with a frantic energy, the unusual thickness of the bark on the north side of the oaks, the deep, bruised purple of the sunsets that promised a season of ice. For Ilara, these were not portents of a difficult winter, but confirmations of an ending. Her ending. Her husband's brother, Marcus, stood on the porch of the farmhouse that was no longer hers. He was a man built of hard lines and harder opinions, his face a permanent mask of grim appraisal. He held the will in his hand, not as a legal document, but as a weapon. Thomas, a man of soft heart and trusting nature, had never updated the papers from their youth, the ones that left the farmstead proper to the eldest son, to Marcus. It was a technicality, a detail of ink on paper that unmade her life. To Marcus, it was an opportunity. He saw Ilara not as a grieving widow, a sister-in-law, but as a tenant whose lease had expired. He had let her stay through the summer out of a begrudging sense of propriety, but with the first frost glazing the windows, his patience had turned to stone. "The law is the law, Ilara," he had said, his voice devoid of sympathy. It was the same tone he used when discussing the price of corn or the need to cull a sick animal. "The main house, the barns, the good pastures, they fall to me." Thomas would have wanted the farm kept whole. He'd said it as if he were honoring his brother's memory, when in fact he was burying it under a landslide of greed. He had offered her nothing, not a room, not a share of the coming harvest, not even a kind word. The community, bound by tradition and a deep-seated respect for patriarchal lines of inheritance, had murmured their assent. A woman alone couldn't run a farm of this size. It was practical. It was sensible. It was a quiet, collective turning of the back. She had stood before him, a ghost in her own home, the scent of the beeswax candles she'd made still lingering in the air, the worn patch on the floorboards by the hearth shaped by her own feet. She had nothing, no family to return to. Her own parents long since passed, no trade to speak of, for her life had been this land, this home, this man. As she packed a small wooden chest with her mother's quilt, a few precious books, and Thomas's whittling knife, Marcus had made a final, grand gesture of what he likely considered charity. It was, in truth, an act of exquisite cruelty. "I won't see you cast out entirely," he'd announced, loud enough for the neighbors who had gathered to watch the sad spectacle to hear. He unrolled a smaller, secondary deed. "The back 40, the rocky slope. It was always considered worthless, but it's yours. Thomas and I used to play there as boys. Consider it a memory." He handed her the paper. The back 40. It was a joke among the local farmers, a patch of land so choked with granite and shale that even the most stubborn weeds struggled for purchase. It was good for nothing but rattlesnakes and regret. And on it, half swallowed by the hillside, sat the old Icehouse. So now she stood on her inheritance, the deed a brittle piece of mockery in her pocket. The wind was a physical force here, unimpeded by the gentle roll of the lower valley. It tore at her hair and bit at her cheeks. Before her, the Icehouse hunkered into the earth. It was not a building so much as a wound in the landscape, a square-mouthed cave lined with massive, sweat-stained blocks of granite. Its thick wooden door, banded with rusted iron, hung crookedly on one hinge. A thick blanket of sod and overgrown thistle constituted its roof, making it look like a burial mound for some forgotten giant. People in the valley had forgotten its original purpose. They saw it only as a relic, a damp, dark place full of spiders and shadow, a symbol of the uselessness of the land it occupied. From the lane below, she could hear the faint sound of laughter. Marcus and a few of his cronies were watching her. "What's she gonna do, farm rocks?" one of them shouted, the words carried and distorted by the wind. Marcus didn't silence him. He stood with his arms crossed, a landowner surveying his domain, satisfied with the neat and tidy conclusion to his brother's messy legacy. Ilara felt a surge of something hot and sharp in her chest, a feeling so fierce it momentarily burned away the cold. It was not hope. It was defiance. She turned her back on them, on the farmhouse that held all her memories, and faced the dark, uninviting maw of the stone house. With a deep breath that tasted of frost and coming snow, she walked toward it. The interior was even more forbidding than the exterior. The air was heavy, still, and thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint mineral tang of stone. It was not cold like the wind outside, but possessed a deep, penetrating chill that felt ancient and absolute. Light struggled through the open doorway, illuminating a floor of packed dirt and a scattering of debris. The walls were magnificent in their construction, a testament to a time when labor was measured in generations. Huge, rough-hewn blocks of granite were fitted together with a precision that left barely a crack for a knife blade. They rose 10 feet before meeting the heavy timber beams that supported the earthen roof. The space was a perfect cube of darkness, a vault designed for one purpose: to defy the sun. In the summer, farmers would pack it with blocks of ice cut from the winter river, insulated with sawdust. The sheer thermal mass of the stone and the earth piled against its walls would keep the ice frozen well into August. It was a house built to hold the cold. To try and live here seemed not just foolish, but a form of slow suicide. The stone would leach the warmth from a fire, from a body, from life itself. It was a tomb, just as Silas, the old farmer from the neighboring plot, would later call it. But as Ilara stood there, shivering in the gloom, her desperation forged a new kind of observation. She pressed a bare hand against the inner stone wall. It was cold, yes, but it was a dead, neutral cold. It was not the biting, aggressive cold of the wind. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun began to set. Inside, the temperature was stable. It was the same deep, unwavering chill it had been when she entered. A memory surfaced, faint and distant, like a story read long ago. It was her grandmother, a woman of the old country, talking about the root cellars back home. She described how they were dug deep into the earth, and how they performed a quiet magic. In the blistering heat of summer they were cool and refreshing, and in the depths of winter, when the world outside was frozen solid, the cellars remained just above freezing, protecting the precious stores of potatoes and carrots from turning to ice and rot. "The earth has a slow heart," her grandmother had said, her voice a low, melodic hum. "It does not race with the sun, nor does it freeze with the moon. It keeps its own time, its own temperature." Ilara looked at the granite walls, at the earthen roof above her head. This was not a house. It was a cellar. It was built into the hillside, with tons of earth insulating it on 3 sides. It was designed to maintain the steady, constant temperature of the deep ground. The builders had used that principle to keep ice. But a principle, she realized with a jolt that was part hope, part terror, is a neutral thing. It can be used for more than one purpose. The house was not designed to be cold, it was designed to stay cold. It was a thermal battery. If it could hold the cold of winter ice all through the summer, what would happen if you filled it not with cold, but with warmth? The idea was so audacious, so contrary to every piece of conventional wisdom she had ever known, that it felt like madness. To heat a house of stone in this valley was a fool's errand. The grand farmhouse she'd just left, with its wooden walls and plaster, consumed a staggering amount of firewood just to keep the chill at bay. The stone was seen as an enemy of warmth. But they were all fighting the air, that vast, ever-moving ocean of cold. They were trying to heat a box that was constantly being robbed by the wind. Her box was different. Her box was wrapped in the greatest insulator of all, the planet itself. A plan began to form, a desperate, feverish piece of engineering born of memory and necessity. She would not fight the stone. She would make it her ally. She would seal the house, make it as airtight as a jar. She would use a small, efficient heat source, a tiny wood stove, and let it run not hot, but steady. The heat would slowly, painstakingly, soak into the immense mass of the granite walls. The stones would drink the warmth, and once saturated, they would radiate it back, creating a constant, stable, gentle heat. The earth would shield her from the wind, and the stone would become her hearth. It was a gamble against physics as anyone in the valley understood it, a bet against the judgment of an entire community. But it was the only bet she had left to make. The work was a brutal education in the realities of her own body. Her first task was to clear the decades of accumulated detritus. She shoveled out layers of rotting leaves, animal bones, and damp black soil, her back screaming in protest. The muscles in her arms, accustomed to kneading bread and tending a garden, burned and trembled with the unaccustomed strain. Each wheelbarrow full of muck that she hauled out into the pale autumn light felt like a victory. As the packed earth floor was revealed, she found it was sloped toward a crude drainage channel, a reminder of the structure's original purpose of managing meltwater. It was another piece of the puzzle, a problem she would have to solve. With the last of her meager funds, she took the wagon into town. The journey was an ordeal of averted eyes and whispered comments. She was Icehouse Alara, now, a local curiosity, a woman touched by grief and madness. At the general store, she bought sacks of lime and sand to mix her own mortar, a small pot-bellied stove no bigger than a milk pail, and several lengths of stovepipe. The storekeeper, Mr. Harris, looked at her purchases with pity. "That little thing won't heat a proper room, ma'am," he said, shaking his head, "let alone a stone box." She paid him without a word, her silence a wall he could not breach. She also bought a new, heavy axe head and a sturdy handle, knowing that fuel would be her lifeblood. The next phase was sealing the tomb. She spent days on a rickety ladder, mixing mortar in a bucket, forcing it into every crack and crevice between the great stones. It was slow, painstaking work. The lime stung her hands, and the grit worked its way under her fingernails. She felt less like a builder and more like an insect, a solitary wasp plastering its nest with mud. She repaired the heavy door, resetting the iron hinges with new pins and shimming the frame until it closed with a solid, satisfying thud. She stuffed every gap around it with strips of wool from a ruined blanket. She was turning the Icehouse into a fortress, not against invaders, but against the insidious, invisible theft of heat by the cold air. Silas, the farmer whose land bordered her own, began to watch her. He was a man weathered like an old fence post, his face a roadmap of hard seasons. He would sit atop his horse on the ridge overlooking her plot, a silent looming figure against the gray sky. He'd seen her hauling dirt, chipping away at stone, and he thought her mad. One afternoon, he could bear it no longer, and rode down. "Girl," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble, "what in God's name do you think you're doing? That place is a tomb. It'll suck the heat right out of your bones. The winter's coming on. You'll die in there." Alara paused, her hands raw and caked with mortar. "I think it will hold the heat, not steal it," she said, her voice steady, though her body ached with exhaustion. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frosty ground. "That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. Stone draws the cold. Everyone knows that. You come stay in my barn. It ain't much, but it's warmer than a grave." It was an act of kindness, buried under a mountain of gruff pragmatism. She was grateful for it, but she could not accept. "Thank you, Silas, but I have to see this through." He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "Don't come crying to me when your water bucket freezes solid an inch from your stove." He turned his horse and rode off, leaving her alone with her work and the echoing certainty of her own folly in his words. The most arduous task was managing the earth itself. She knew she needed more insulation on the outside. Using a spade and the wheelbarrow, she began to cut thick squares of sod from the parts of her land that had any soil at all. She piled them against the exposed front wall of the icehouse, building up a thick, living blanket. Then she dug a deep trench around the entire structure, filling it with rocks to create a French drain that would channel groundwater away from her foundation, fighting the dampness that was her other great enemy. It was backbreaking, relentless labor. She would work until the sun went down, her muscles screaming, then fall into a sleep of pure exhaustion on a pallet inside the still chilling stone room, only to wake at dawn and do it all again. Marcus paid her another visit. He arrived not on foot, but on his fine black horse, as if to emphasize the distance between their stations. He surveyed her work, the piles of sod, the trench, the neatly sealed stonework, with a sneer. "What is this madness?" he demanded. "You're turning the place into a hovel, an animal's den. You are an embarrassment to Thomas's name." "I'm building a home," she replied, her voice low and tight. She refused to let him see how much his words cut her. "This is not a home," he thundered. "This is a hole in the ground. You're making a spectacle of yourself. People are talking. They're laughing. They say my brother's wife has gone feral. I want you to stop this. Go to the church, ask for charity. Leave this place." "This place is mine," she said, meeting his gaze. "You saw to that." The defiance in her eyes seemed to infuriate him. He saw not a woman fighting for survival, but an ungrateful wretch who was failing to perform her grief with the proper, helpless humility. He wheeled his horse around. "Fine. Freeze in your hole. But when you come begging this winter, my door will be closed." His visit, meant to break her, instead hardened her resolve. His scorn was fuel. The town's laughter was mortar. She worked with a grim, methodical fury. She installed the small stove in the center of the room, carefully running the pipe up through a hole she painstakingly chiseled through the thick timber and sod of the roof, sealing it with clay and stone. She built a small, raised wooden platform for her bed to keep her off the cold floor. She spent weeks cutting and splitting firewood from the deadfall on the wooded parts of her slope, creating a massive stack against the one sheltered wall outside her door. It was a dragon's hoard of BTUS, her only real wealth in the world. One morning she found a gift. Just inside her property line, near the path she took to the woods, sat a pile of perfectly seasoned split oak firewood. Beside it was a newer, better axe, its edge sharpened to a razor gleam. There was no note. There was no one in sight. But she knew it was from Silas. He still thought she was a fool, but he was a fool who deserved to be warm while she met her end. It was the first act of grace she had received in months, and she nearly wept with the gratitude of it. It was a sign that perhaps she was not entirely alone. By the time the first real snow fell, a light, dusting coat of white that outlined the world in stark relief. Her home was ready. From the outside, it looked even more like a part of the landscape than before. A green and brown hummock with a thin curl of smoke rising from its peak. Inside, the transformation was astonishing. She lit the first fire in the little stove, feeding it small pieces of kindling until a steady blaze took hold. For the first 2 days, the place felt no warmer. The stone was drinking the heat, just as she'd predicted. It was a terrifying test of her theory. The stove glowed red, but the air remained stubbornly chill. Silas's words about a water bucket freezing echoed in her mind. She kept the fire going, a constant low-level burn, feeding it every few hours, day and night. Then, on the third day, she felt it. A change. The air was no longer biting. The chill had receded. She placed her hand on the stone wall a few feet from the stove. It was no longer cold. It was cool, but a neutral cool. The feeling of a river stone that had been sitting in the sun. By the fourth day, the walls were faintly, almost imperceptibly, warm to the touch. The immense thermal battery was charged. The stove was no longer fighting the stone, it was working with it. The heat it produced was held, stored, and gently radiated back into the small space. The temperature inside stabilized at a comfortable, even warmth, a quiet, peaceful heat that felt as steady and ancient as the earth itself. She had done it. She had built a home inside a stone. The winter arrived not like a guest, but like an invading army. The old-timers had been right. It came with a fury that stunned the valley into silence. The sky turned the color of lead, and the wind began a low, mournful howl that did not cease for a week. Then the snow came, not in flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal torrent. It was a blizzard for the ages, a storm that would be given a name and enter the annals of local history as the Great White Death. Temperatures plummeted to levels no living person could remember. The wind scoured the landscape, piling snow into monstrous drifts that buried fences, swallowed sheds, and pressed against the doors of the farmhouses with the weight of a glacier. In the valley, life became a desperate battle for warmth. The fine, large farmhouse of Marcus was a sieve. The wind found every crack in the window frames, every gap under the doors. The cold radiated through the plaster walls. He and his family huddled around their massive hearth, burning through their woodpile at an alarming rate. The more they stoked the fire, the more it seemed to draw the cold air in from outside, creating vicious drafts that snaked across the floor. His pipes froze and burst in the first 2 days. His livestock in the barn, despite being sheltered, began to sicken and die from the sheer, unrelenting cold. His wealth, his comfort, his certainty were all being systematically dismantled by the weather. For the rest of the community, it was much the same. Families abandoned their upstairs bedrooms, living in single rooms, stuffing rags into every crevice, their world shrinking to the small circle of warmth around a stove. The sound of the wind was a constant torment, a reminder of the fragility of their shelters. The snow piled up, isolating them, turning each home into a frozen island in a sea of white. In her stone house, Alara experienced the storm as a distant rumor. The wind howled far above her earthen roof, the sound muffled and remote, like the cry of a beast passing in the night. The snow piled deep on top and around her home, and with every inch that fell, her insulation grew stronger. She was entombed, but she was safe. Inside, the air was still and quiet and warm. The little stove required only a few logs every 4 or 5 hours to maintain its steady output. The granite walls, now fully saturated with days of accumulated heat, radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. There were no drafts. There were no cold spots. She could sit in a simple dress and read one of her books by the light of a single candle, the fury of the world outside a mere abstraction. She had a store of dried meat, flour, and preserved vegetables. She had water from a small sealed cistern she had built. She was not just surviving. She was comfortable. She was at peace. Silas, in his sturdy but conventional farmhouse, fought a losing battle. He was old, and his bones felt the cold like a physical blow. His woodpile, which he'd thought more than adequate, was shrinking with terrifying speed. The wind forced its way through the chinking of his log walls, and the frost crept inward from the windows, painting elaborate, beautiful, and deadly patterns on the panes. On the fourth night of the blizzard, his main stovepipe clogged with ice and soot. back-puffing smoke into his single room. He managed to clear it, but the effort left him exhausted and chilled to the core. He knew, with the grim certainty of a man who has lived his whole life by the seasons, that he would not last another night. The fire was dying, and so was he. Fear, cold, and a sliver of desperate curiosity propelled him. He thought of the madwoman in her stone tomb. He imagined her frozen solid, a tragic monument to her own folly. But what if she wasn't? What if her insane theory had contained a grain of truth? The thought was absurd, but it was the only thought that offered any alternative to freezing to death alone in his house. It was a journey of less than half a mile, but in the blinding, waist-deep snow and the razor-sharp wind, it was an Arctic expedition. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned and stumbled out into the white chaos. He followed the fence line, a ghostly presence he could feel more than see. The wind stole his breath and froze the moisture in his beard. He fell twice, the snow a cold, suffocating embrace. He nearly gave up, the thought of simply lying down and letting the quiet cold take him a seductive whisper. But he pushed on, driven by that single impossible question. He finally saw it, a low mound barely visible in the swirling snow, with a thin, almost invisible plume of heat shimmering from its chimney. There was no smoke, just the faint distortion of the air that signaled a clean, hot fire. He stumbled toward the door, his legs numb, his hands clumsy claws. He raised a fist and pounded on the thick wood. The sound was a dull, flat thud, swallowed by the storm. He pounded again, using the last of his strength, and shouted her name. The door swung inward, and he fell forward into a wall of quiet, gentle warmth. He landed on his knees, the shock of the transition from the Arctic hell outside to this serene haven so profound it left him breathless. Alara stood before him, holding a candle, her face calm and concerned. The air smelled of warm stone, wood smoke, and baking bread. He looked past her. The small stove glowed with a cherry-red cheer. A kettle sat steaming on its surface. A loaf of bread was rising on a small table. He could feel the heat not as a blast from the stove, but as a presence in the room, radiating from the very walls around him. He pushed himself up, his eyes wide with disbelief, and looked at her. His own home, 20 times the size of this room, was an icebox. This hole in the ground was a sanctuary. How? The word was a croak, torn from a throat raw with cold and disbelief. It's warm. Alara simply smiled, a small, tired but triumphant smile. The earth keeps its own time, she said softly, quoting a memory he could not understand. Come in, Silas. Get out of the cold. When the great blizzard finally broke, the valley looked like a new, unfinished world, sculpted from white marble. The silence was profound. Then, slowly, tentatively, people began to emerge. The toll was heavy. Several of the outlying homesteads had lost entire herds of cattle. 2 elderly people were found to have frozen in their beds. The doctor's buggy was busy for a week, treating cases of frostbite and pneumonia. Marcus's farm was a ruin. His grand house was a disaster of burst pipes and water damage. He had lost more than half his livestock. The storm had broken not just his assets, but his pride. He was a man humbled, reduced to the same level of desperate survival as everyone else. The story that began to circulate was, at first, treated as a fever dream, the ramblings of an old man addled by the cold. Silas told anyone who would listen about Alara's stone house. He described the gentle, pervasive warmth, the quiet stillness, the impossible comfort she had created in the heart of the storm. He had stayed with her for 2 days, and it had saved his life. It wasn't a house, he'd say, his voice filled with a convert's awe. It was like being inside a baking oven after the fire's gone out. The heat was in the stone. She didn't heat the air, you see. She heated the house itself. People were skeptical, but they were also desperate. Their own homes had failed them. The conventional wisdom had proven to be a flimsy shield against the fury of nature. Curiosity, stronger now than their scorn, drew them up the rocky path to her door. They came in ones and twos, their faces a mixture of doubt and hope. They expected to see some trick, some massive fire pit that consumed a forest of wood. Instead, they found Alara, quiet and composed, and her small, unassuming home. She let them in. They would step across the threshold and stop, their faces slack with the same astonishment that had struck Silas. They would touch the walls, feeling the faint stored warmth. They saw the tiny stove and the modest woodpile and could not reconcile it with the profound comfort of the space. The questions began. How did she seal the stones? How did she keep the damp out? What was the secret to the chimney that it didn't smoke? The woman they had called the Mole Woman, the fool on the hill, was suddenly a sage. Her status shifted overnight. She was no longer an object of pity or ridicule. She was a source of knowledge, of a new kind of wisdom that had been proven in the crucible of the blizzard. They stopped calling her Icehouse Alara. They began to speak of the Alara method. She shared her knowledge freely, without triumph or condescension. She explained the simple principle of thermal mass, of using the earth as an ally instead of an enemy. She showed them the drainage trench, the layered sod insulation, the way she had mortared the stones. She spoke not like an inventor, but like someone who had simply listened to what the world was trying to tell her. Her quiet confidence was more powerful than any boast. That spring, a change came over the valley. Men began to look at their own root cellars with new eyes. They started digging, expanding them, reinforcing the walls. They asked for Alara's advice, which she gave patiently. Silas was her most ardent disciple, helping his neighbors build their own winter houses, small, semi-subterranean structures for refuge during the worst of the cold. The idea, once considered madness, was becoming the new common sense. Marcus, his fortune diminished and his arrogance shattered, never came to her. But one day she saw him from a distance, supervising his hired hands as they dug into the hillside behind his damaged farmhouse, laying the stone foundations for a new, much smaller structure. It was a silent, bitter admission of her victory. Decades passed. The valley endured other hard winters, but the great white death of that year was never forgotten, and neither were its lessons. The Alara houses, as they came to be known, became a signature of the region's architecture. They were refined, improved upon, but the core principle remained the same. They saved countless lives, both human and animal, in the years that followed. They were a testament to a shift in thinking, a move away from fighting the environment to understanding its rhythms and embracing its strengths. Alara lived out a long and peaceful life in her warm stone home. She never remarried, never sought wealth or status. Her richness was of a different kind. It was in the security of her hearth, the respect of her community, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had stared into the abyss of despair and found, in its depths, the materials with which to build a new life. She had taken the most worthless piece of land, the most despised structure, and a judgment of madness, and from them she had created the warmest, safest home in the valley. Her story became a lesson whispered from one generation to the next. It taught that the greatest value is often hidden in plain sight, buried beneath the surface of what the world deems worthless. It was a reminder that the loudest voices of conventional wisdom are often wrong, and that true innovation comes from listening to the quiet whispers of the earth, to the forgotten knowledge of ancestors, to the stubborn, defiant beat of one's own heart. It was a story about the courage to look foolish in the pursuit of a deeper truth, and the profound, enduring power that comes from turning a place of cold judgment into a sanctuary of warmth.